Welcome everyone to today's weekly web chat from Prairie Public. I'm Darcy Bakigard, and today we're continuing our chats about project-based learning, and our focus on this chat is creating cross-curricular connections as part of your PBL. So joining me today is Heidi Crowley from Winnipeg, Canada. We've gone international with our chat. Introduce yourself, Heidi. What do you teach? Where are you at? Just a little overview of you.
Okay, so I am at Grade Academy in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I teach grade 7 to 11 this year. It's usually grade 7 to 12. And I'm at an independent school, so it's like a private school. And yeah, I teach mainly social studies, 1 English, 2 technology. And so our social studies is a mix of geography and history and civics and current events. And I was looking at the North Dakota curriculum, and it seems like it's pretty similar. Some American history, some current events, government. So it might be at certain, like, different grade levels, but I think the content ideas are pretty similar.
What got you started? Why did you want to try PBL with your students, or why was it important to you to bring project-based learning to your classroom and to your students?
So we're a religious school, so we have religious courses, Hebrew courses, and we also have our regular core Manitoba curriculum. And so because of that, it means that time is precious. And so anything that you can get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. But also, I think anyone who's been in the classroom, even like 10 minutes, you know that anything that's going to be self-directed by students, anything that's going to be driven by their own interests, by their own passions, anything that's going to just constantly demand that they are critically thinking and that they're engaged and that they're working collaboratively, anything that's going to be hitting those is just naturally going to be something that stays with them way better than something that you're just kind of sage on the stage, regurgitating, here you go. And there's a time and place for meat and potatoes. I don't think everything can be PBL based, but I think when you have the kids come back, you know, and it's 5 years after graduation and they're still saying, I remember doing this. The ones that they're going to remember are the PBLs. The ones they're going to remember are the walking tours of downtown where you made them become tour guides. Like, they're going to remember those pieces.
They're going to remember the experiences, like when learning was an experience, not just a list and a memorized and a set of facts, but when they were experiencing and getting to apply their knowledge, it's the doing that really solidifies the learning. So how much of your year would you estimate, like how much is it that you've turned over to project-based learning?
Well, I'm very lucky. I'm gonna say lucky. I'm very lucky because I teach grade 7 to 11 this year, in the sense that because I have so many courses, there are grades that just lend themselves to PBL based on like the content and also based on the kids. There are classes where you think, you know what, this is going to be something that we're going to do some inroads in, or we're going to be doing certain pieces, but it's not necessarily going to be to your advantage right now. And then there's other groups where you think they are so ready for it, they need this. So this particular year, my grade 7 course for social studies, I would say I'm doing about 30% of the year is PBL. And so it's not, you know, like a little cherry on top at the end of a unit. It's one of like the core concepts of this is how we learn, and this is how we explore, and this is how we share. Whereas for my grade 11 course, it's probably only about 15%, like if I had to kind of give it a number, and they would be kind of staggered throughout the year. So it's very different depending on the age and also depending on the amount of curriculum you have to get through.
I like that point though about the curriculum, and that just different curriculum content can lend itself better to different strategies or approaches. And so since we got that curriculum word thrown out there, how do you start the process of thinking cross-curricularly? So we've been having chats about how do we just structure a PBL within our classroom. And I think elementary school teachers are at a huge advantage here. They have a different set of challenges, but they're at a huge advantage because I think they just have a much better sense of what those curriculum needs are across the content areas, because again, good or bad, they're responsible for all of that. So they have that kind of in front of them. What is your advice? How do we as single subject teachers, or even as elementary school teachers, start holding multiple sets of outcomes in our heads? Like, how do we start that task of collaborating cross-curricularly?
And I mean, every school is so different, right? Because there are schools where you have a department of one, right? And then there are schools where you have a department of 25. And so there are very, very different dynamics. For me, I wanted it to be as authentic as possible. I didn't want to shove a PBL in because I wanted to do a PBL. I wanted to find the course that needed a PBL and then use that. So I knew right away that my grade 7 was just like a natural fit. And then I'm someone who I really like my curriculum, so I like to look through it. So I know mine, and I think most teachers are like, yeah, I know my standards, I know what I need. And so from there, because I knew what course I wanted, I also knew that, okay, I have a ton of physical geography. I have a ton of, so when we were talking, one of the first things I did was actually reach out to you, Darcy, and we kind of use that overlap. And you were saying, look, there's like a quarter of the year for both years where the marriage would just be seamless. And so I think that's one of the essential things for PBL that's cross-curricular, is that if you're kind of like, well, we could do it like this and it could fit and we could kind of turn it sideways and like jam it in there, that's probably not the best way of doing it. But when you look at the curriculum, I mean, the grade 7 North Dakotan standards, I mean, when you're talking about current events and natural resources and wars, and I mean, the number of ways you could use that. I mean, obviously, English language arts is one that you can always find really nice streams to.
Yeah.
Right? You say, listen, why don't we read I Am Malala? And we're going to be taking a look at what does it mean to be a girl in Pakistan? What does it mean to be living in a developing nation? What is, right? All those pieces. But you can also say, okay, we are going to be working with science and we're going to be looking at some of their curricular outcomes. We're going to be working with math and we're going to be looking at, okay, well, what does poverty look like? What does success look like in Pakistan? How do we show that graphically? How do we show those relationships? So,
sure.
Yeah, I think one of those things is if you kind of know how you want to go about it in terms of, you know what, I'm really passionate about this particular thing. I want to know more about this particular idea in my curriculum. Then you have an idea as to how you can start building those bridges. If you're kind of going in with, I'd like to do something cross-curricular, it can be a little bit tricky finding a colleague, because then you're almost kind of saying, could you show me how to do this? Can you? And sometimes if you're feeling inundated, that can be tricky.
So like what I'm hearing is that difference of coming to a colleague and saying, I would like to do something with you, might be overwhelming for that other person. And while you might be very excited, you've just kind of shifted the responsibility.
Yeah.
But the reality is it's too open. So I like that. What are your passions and what have you seen a strong passion connection with in kids?
Yes.
Take 2 or 3 ideas to a colleague and say, I would like to do some cross-curricular. I think there's room in this idea or this idea. What do you think? And so now you've really focused the conversation and given you both a place to start. And it might evolve from there.
Yeah, but you're right. It's that kind of, the collaborative piece is huge. But I do think that in the back of your mind, you know that there is like 1 or 2 topics that you or your class just like flew with, or you could see that they had a real connection, maybe it's more to the human geography than the physical geography. You kind of know your kids. And so if you just give like a carte blanche of like, okay, whatever goes, everyone kind of has a little bit of an idea, I think. And so sometimes I can kind of create of like, well, I don't know if this is, and so I think if you go in with an idea of, listen, it makes perfect sense that we're teaching something really similar here. I'm pretty flexible about like the specifics of which topic we pick. So if you have a preference, that's great. But this is where I'm seeing an overlap. Would you want to do something?
I like that because it's targeted, it's specific. And I really appreciate what you were also saying about your passions, but the second thing that you just said now was also, what are the kids interested in? And I really appreciate that your brain tries to branch out, because I agree with you, there's the obvious English social studies overlap.
Works every time.
It just in general works. But I really appreciate that you're stretching to go, okay, but what about math? How might we get involved with science? Is there a string in here that connect with a health class, or with a physical education class, with a music class, with one of our tech ed classes? Is there a connection? You also mentioned you teach tech classes. Is there a connection where there's a technology piece that is being created as part of this that is a collaboration with something going on there? So just to continue, I like this reminder for myself as an English teacher. Don't just go with the easy and obvious because it's easy and obvious. Keep pushing.
Well, and just to kind of reiterate too, I always think, I mean, I'm not an ELA teacher by training. I do have one class this year, but I think sometimes it can be a little bit of a slippery slope that we always see ELA as kind of like a mortar course, right? It's the one that can kind of put other courses together, and it's just so easy. And so sometimes it can kind of erode at the value of English itself, for those literary skills, for those analysis skills, for the actual like experience with literature versus, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a novel that's, you know, a geographic focus or a historical focus, but if that's the only way that you're using it, it can start to kind of feel like English is the one size fits all cap that we can just kind of shove into any hole. And I always worry about that for English or for art or for some of the humanities, that there is a place for cross-curricular for any course. And I think sometimes we kind of shy away from the math and the science because sometimes the topics can kind of feel a little bit overwhelming.
A question, I heard this, and this is a little, it's not off topic, but it's a little random. I listened to a lovely podcast, just the podcast PD, and a social studies teacher was talking about shifting away from teaching history chronologically and shifting to teaching social studies thematically.
Yeah.
And there was something in that really clicked for me. And I do wonder if that's an extra tip as we're thinking about cross-curricular connections. If we stop thinking about some of our curriculum as a linear progression, because I taught American Lit, and I taught American Lit the way I learned American Lit the first few years that I taught it, chronologically, where we looked at early American writing and we looked at how writing had evolved throughout American history. But if I thought of teaching American Lit or American history as a thematic exploration, which is how, the longer I taught, right, I kept shifting more and more that direction. I think we could really unlock even more potential for how thematically do these things connect together. Does that click for you? Does that make any sense of how you might approach different units?
Well, for Manitoba, about 10 years ago, we went through the thematic versus chronological discussion. And it was a real, I mean, you can imagine in social studies in particular, we are linear, we are sequential. So it was one of those things that we were kind of like, okay. But what we noticed, because thematic is wonderful, because what ends up happening naturally, like organically in classroom conversations, is that you do thematic approaches. They'll say, what about this? What about that? What about this? And so you're talking about land clearances, you're talking about the unification of Italy, and then suddenly you find yourself talking about Brexit, or these things happen in the classroom. The issue, though, with what we were seeing in the classroom is that if you take a fully thematic approach, specifically, and I should say this as a caveat, specifically in social studies, where it is history, what ends up happening is that you oftentimes have students who haven't necessarily really cemented their mental timeline. So in terms of just walking around thinking, okay, Greeks, then the Romans, then medieval, if you start doing it thematically, what ends up happening is that you know the core concepts and you know the big ideas. And for some students and for some learning goals, that's awesome. But for a lot of students, I think what we kind of want them to understand is progression and also regression and the whole picture. And so for grade 11, for example, what I do is I do a blend. So we will do thematic and chronological. So we're talking about identity, and we'll talk about identity through Canadian history. And then we'll talk about First Peoples, and we'll talk about First Peoples through Canadian history all the way up to today. And as we go through, what we're doing for each unit is we're going through chronologically, but we're also reweaving in each of the previous units. So we don't suddenly stop talking about Indigenous people. That doesn't work in Canada. They're a part of every stage. We can't stop talking about identity. It's part of every stage. And so because we worked it chronologically and thematically, we just keep weaving into the braid. And that works for history. I can imagine in ELA and for art that there is that need for balance. How did we get to Kafka? How did we get to Warhol? But then also kind of looking, okay, how do they feed each other and how are they standing on their own? So it's very different, I think, based on course.
That makes sense to me. And I love that image of weaving those two things together, of helping students find that foundation of what are those keystones and those key markers throughout history, so they do have a sense. Because my reaction to that was simultaneously, I really like that idea. And then also even as an American Lit teacher, saying, yes, but one thing feeds the next. Absolutely. And one thing is a reaction to the other thing. So can you truly understand Romanticism if you don't understand that it was a reaction to the Enlightenment, like the sterility of the Enlightenment that came before it? And can you understand like those shifts? So I like that combination of weaving those things in. And once we introduce a concept, it doesn't just go away, it becomes part of our fabric and our framework. So let's talk about some of the things you're specifically doing, because you have this beautiful canvas that you've laid out of kind of your, I think in just this short conversation, we've heard a bit about your educator philosophy, really. So what are you doing with these kids? Like, can you talk to us about a cross-curricular project? And then we'll just try to break it down into some tips of like, how do we approach the balance of a cross-curricular approach?
Oh, I think with PBL and I think with cross-curricular PBL, it's an idea that before you even get started knowing where you're going, you don't necessarily have to go to the colleague that you're going to be working with, but going to a friend or another teacher and saying like, I'm really wanting to do this. What do you think about that? There's nothing wrong with having a partner in crime as you get things started, and also having someone who can kind of, point you towards some resources, because I think oftentimes we kind of think like, this is, the best thing. No one has ever done this before. And then you're like, oh, 72 times. So
I think there's a freedom in working with someone. It's great if you can find this person in your building and you have a colleague and you can bounce and go. A lot of us, don't have a colleague because you're the only something. You're the only third grade teacher. So it's hard to collaborate with other third grade teachers. And so I get that. But there was a freedom in collaborating with you because I felt very free to throw out, sometimes I felt pretty weird ideas and just ask questions, because I had no stake in what you chose to do. So I could really be a random sounding board and throw things out, and you were able to take what worked for you, ignore my suggestions or questions that you just didn't feel would work for your students. And I didn't care because I didn't have a stake. I wasn't also having to teach those classes. So there was a really interesting freedom I found in collaborating with someone on a project that I wasn't going to teach. And it was really fun.
Reciprocally, it was also very nice to plan with someone who didn't have a stake, who you was just kind of like, there was no hidden messaging of like, I would prefer this unit or this would be better. They just like, what about this? What about that? Okay, no problem. And so there is something to be said about finding like that outside player who you kind of think, listen, before I know what I want to do, I want to just kind of throw past on the wall. I want to see what sticks, and I'm just going to, you know, kind of go from there. So our starting point actually was that we looked at the social studies curriculum, and as soon as you saw it, you were like, well, you know, I'm no detective here, but if we look it over, the obvious ones are so present, right? So when we're looking at world geography, Earth's crust, ecosystems, the overlap is just waiting to be tapped into. And so then it's just a matter of like, okay, well, how would we like it to look then? What can we do? The outcomes or the standards for North Dakota are a little bit more open. Ours are very specific. It works. I mean, grade 7 is a great PBL year, especially because you can start building some of the patterns and structure so that in later years, it's just part of the routine, part of the way that they think about things. I noticed that in later years, if you get started in PBL when they're in grade 11 and suddenly they're worried about like, well, this is a grade I'm going to be applying for universities with, and I'm very conscious of what my GPA is looking like, then they're going to be less willing to take risks. And you have to be aware of that. And so if you introduce some of the standard practices that you would expect for a good PBL, and some of the skills and behaviors, then they're just relying on muscle memory. Then it's suddenly way less stressful. And grade 7s, they love taking risks. They love being self-led, and they have no problem asking questions. There's no shame in their game of like, oh no, I don't want to. No, they will ask any question. And so because of that, it's like a perfect symmetry. So the social studies and the science work really well together. As I say, the North Dakotan ones for grade 7 also seem to be pretty open. So a science and social studies could work really well there too. And so what we decided to do was we decided to take a look at ecosystems, because ecosystems seem like a very natural fit. So this is kind of how we broke it down. And so we went in for the entire thing just kind of knowing that we were going to have to use the curriculum as our foundation. That was going to be our stepping stone for both courses. And in that way, we could make sure that we weren't assessing the same thing twice in 2 courses, because otherwise, how authentic is that? It means that you're setting a kid up to fail twice, or you are somehow rewarding, you know, so that's tricky. We also wanted to make sure that the outcomes that were being hit were really robust on both sides. So it wasn't lopsided that one course would be really helped and the other one just be kind of some skills that would be covered. I wanted to be content both, and we were both really mindful, I think, of making sure that we were creating an assignment that regardless as to where you were on your learning journey, if you needed a little bit extra support, it was completely doable in this assignment. If you needed a little bit of an extra challenge because you needed to be really, really kind of pushed because you were ready for that, then it was also built into. So all this one is an ecosystem that you'd be working with in a group. So we started with these ecosystems. Each and every one of them link up to a PBS Learning Center. And so it's not like you have to suddenly, start from scratch. All the students will have a same kind of starting point in terms of access to resources and a really student-friendly entrance. And then from there, they can start doing further research. And these are just a few of them. Obviously, depending on your area, or maybe you have a particular region that has a unique ecosystem, of course, you could add it in there. We took a global approach because ours focused on world geography. So,
and I like that as a possible starting point. Again, we talked about passions. We're talking about those. What are the key concepts? What are the standards and skills? Some of this might be finding a really amazing resource that just like that might be what sparks the idea for you. We started with those standards of going, it seems like there's a lot of overlap here. And then there was this like final cherry on top that it went, oh, and there's also this super user-friendly resource about all these different ecosystems. So one thing snowballed into the next, but it could easily have happened in reverse.
We decided to do it as making a website and then doing a class interview. And sometimes even the idea of like, well, I definitely want to be using technology. I know these kids are really passionate about that, and that would have like a huge, hook for them. That even something as simple as, well, I know what media I want to use. I know what I want my final product, and then reverse engineering it. That's also fine. I have a tendency to be sequential, just in my, but some people are so abstract that they can kind of start from a side angle, or kind of think, wouldn't this be an interesting way of doing it? So there's no right way or wrong way. I think that's one of the great things about cross-curricular, is that because you're going to have more cooks in the kitchen, as you have this as a starting point, it might come out, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And so even something that does start sequentially or does start as a reverse can start kind of taking on multi-dimensional kind of facets. So this is a social studies science, but the ways that you could easily incorporate art into this, you could easily incorporate drama into this, you could easily incorporate math into this, are right on the surface. So it wouldn't be something that you'd be trying to dig down, but as the students are working through some of the numbers and the different, stats about ecosystems at risk, etc., it might make sense to show it graphically. And suddenly you might be asking the math teacher, can you show them how to work pie charts? Because I feel like this would be a great learning moment for them.
Even if you're not doing a full-blown cross-curricular connection, it doesn't mean that you can't get some of the other topics involved. I like that. That's a nice, and so maybe it's just a baby step with one teacher where, yeah, you're just tapping into that other teacher's expertise of, I know you talk to the kids about this. Can you use this ecosystem project as a specific example when you show them how to do this skill?
When you have that conversation with the teacher, 90% of the time it's going to be like, yeah, okay, no problem. And then it also means that they're going to be seeing these students working with these numbers. They're going to see how engaged they are. And then at the end of the year, when you're saying like, thank you so much for doing that, that was really, really helpful, that worked really well, the chances are that the conversation is going to become something more like, you know what, it would be great next year if we could time it out perfectly so that we could do it at the same time. And wouldn't it be nice if, and then suddenly you have complete buy-in, you're not trying to convince someone, because they can see, yeah, this works perfectly. This is great. We have a unit on thermodynamics in grade 11 chemistry. And so when I'd be teaching early 20th century, late 19th century Canadian history, and we'd be talking about the impact of no refrigeration on health, no refrigeration on lifestyle. And they'd also be talking about how important refrigeration is in chemistry. And we realized, why aren't we talking about it together? You're talking about organ transplants and the need for refrigeration for that. I'm talking about how movies became part of our kind of common culture because they're the only air-conditioned place in the entire city in hot summers. So people would go on average once every 10 days because you could be cool. And so you can look at how our entire culture shifts because of something like cold. But you can also start taking a look at things like, well, how does science benefit from it too? So oftentimes we have these commonalities happening, and then you talk to the kids and they're like, yeah, I just learned this a week ago.
That's so powerful for the kids as learners to hear these concepts reiterated and to play with this. When we started this conversation by talking about that, getting that hands-on and getting the kids playing with the information and creating a learning experience that they would remember. And if they're experiencing this in multiple places, oh man, just fireworks going off on all level for those kiddos. On like, what does the project look like in the different content areas?
So what we had them do is basically, obviously they need to start doing some research, working together to find out, okay, what exactly is our ecosystem? What is it about it in terms of what's unique about it? What flora fauna do we have there? How are humans interacting with it? Where on earth is it? All these kinds of things, because they were going to be the experts in the classroom on this particular ecosystem. And then to make it into something that A, would be engaging for them, but B, would also be an authentic task that would be something that they could easily be asked to do in future, we decided to have them make websites, Google sites or Wix or whatever website creator that they like. The key is obviously free and easy. So whatever one they prefer to use, that's great. But the websites that they come up with are beautiful because they are so aesthetically picky. They're raised in such a digital landscape that they'll be looking at a title being like, that font is not quite right. And so they're going to be like the most persnickety people making this. Not only in terms of content, they're going to be all over that. They're also going to be looking at how do we make our websites. So that was the particular science piece that we had them make the website and then present their biggest takeaways and their findings, the things that they really were proud of about their website, or the content that they just thought was amazing. They could also talk about the challenges in a quick presentation to their science class, and what they noticed when they were making their ecosystem. Maybe there just wasn't information on a particular thing. Maybe their ecosystem is incredibly remote, and so there wasn't a lot of information about the interactions with humans because there's not a lot of humans nearby, or those kinds of things. And so sometimes those were equally important. And then in social studies, we did a class interview where they were given a list of questions that they could prepare for. 5 students would randomly be selected to choose the questions. And then we have just a few questions, all of which connect directly with the social studies curriculum. So it wasn't, we pulled them out of the air because they felt right. These are direct, like, let's connect everything. And so both sides are looking at the same ecosystem. They're looking at the same, how well do you understand what your ecosystem is, how it's being affected, how it affects others. But you're looking at completely different outcomes, and you're looking at completely different ways of assessing them. And in that way too, you might have that student who is absolutely incredible when it comes to building things with technology, when it comes to designing and laying things out. But when it comes time to talk in front of the class, is really struggling. And you have the person who could talk all day and who doesn't have that self-management always to really take the time to edit. And so if you can kind of mix those groups together, you'll also notice that the PBL feeds itself that way. So we made sure that our science project would be marking, Mac mouses have me completely thrown, but it would be assessing completely different information and completely different outcomes than the social studies. And so by doing that, you have 2 ways to shine. You have twice as many opportunities to show your understanding. And it also was a good challenge for some of the students who maybe were used to relying on their communication skills, or maybe were used to relying on their partner's communication skills. So it was a little bit of a nice challenge.
For those people who are tuning in, links to this project are in the PBL resource doc that's linked in the video description. In the middle of the packet, there are a couple of slides that say project ideas, and these are all sample projects. This ecosystem project is very cleverly titled Social Studies and Science Ecology Project.
So this is one of my students, or I should say 2 of my students. They decided to look at Kenya in particular. And so they took a slightly different approach. Most of the other students used a lot of drop-down menus, etc., with the different tabs for the topics. They thought that that was a really easy way that they could go through and make sure, am I hitting every single topic? But for these 2 students, they really liked the idea that you got a sense of how one kind of flowed into the other. And so even like that kind of decision of, okay, we want it to look like this, and this is why, and this is, this is how we came up with this idea, and this is why it's important to us. Those discussions that you get to, hear in the classroom, you think, okay, yeah, you could polka dot it and call it like whatever you want to do, but the discussion behind it is so incredible. So,
and that just deeper thinking of not only, okay, we're going to share our ideas, but what is the best way to share our ideas?
They went in and they found what they wanted. And, I was kind of saying, like, Google Sites is this, and you could try this one. And they all just kind of said, Wix is pretty. And so they all just kind of went that way. And it worked really, really well. We didn't have any times where, things were lost or they thought they had put great saving. Most groups had drop-down menus all the way across the top. And they just thought, well, no, we want the content to kind of be there. We want you to see like flora and fauna. Okay, that's going to be affecting the ecosystem. Okay, that's going to be affecting the climate. And so they wanted to kind of show the build.
And they wanted one thing to feed naturally into the other. And I really like that this project lends itself to those kinds of curation questions. And that's one of those layers, like what you were saying earlier, that it doesn't have to be where all the students get. But for those kids who are higher thinkers in general, this is a great extra layer of a challenge. If you are working on a project and there's a graphic arts class that is willing to tackle that, maybe that is something that they are specifically looking at: balance and shape and composition and flow and style and all of those choices that a graphic artist goes into. That might be a cross-curricular connection that an art teacher might really enjoy helping with.
Especially, I think, for grade 7 too, because then you're starting to build some of the foundational ideas of kind of artistic design, in terms of, you know, nothing is just happening on its own. So this is another one of the websites. You can kind of see here, just to kind of go back to the grade 7 ones that we were talking about. This one, they use the titles at the top. And for them, they felt like it made sense to them because they really wanted to make sure that each of them kind of stood on their own. You can see that they spend a lot of time even just making sure, like, what picture should we have? We want this picture to relate to what we're talking about up here, but at the bottom. And so those kinds of things, just hearing those discussions with the students is not anything that I would put into a rubric of like, how well did you balance your page? How, you know, pretty was your menu bar? But it's one of those things that sometimes ends up being like the big discussion in the group, because it ends up being something that it turns out that one of the partners is really passionate about. One of the interesting things I found in the website, but I think really in any PBL, is the students that you think are going in with a strength, right? Like, this kid is so good at technology, he's going to find it so easy. She is so great at the math, she's going to just like sail with this. They're usually really good with it. But you also have these kind of the dark horses where you think, I don't know, they could be okay. Maybe I'll put them, you know, in a stronger group. And they end up being the shining star where you think, oh my goodness. Okay, it turns out that when it's you making the decisions, you're really, really good at finding the answers and critical thinking and solving some of the problems that come up. So it's an interesting thing. I find PBLs often, they teach you as a teacher, but they also teach the students, because the student maybe who's the most worried going in and being like, I don't know, I just don't know, is the one who runs with it. And the kid sometimes who goes in being like, no problem, is the one who afterwards thinks, okay, it turns out I actually have to follow the steps. Okay, good to know. So it's an interesting thing. Another activity attached here, in case you would like to see it, that you can kind of view, and it's basically the next step. So it's again marrying the science and the social studies, and it's looking at, okay, now that we understand different places in the world in terms of the physical geography, what about the human geography? What are some areas that are facing issues or problems, and what are some solutions that they're looking at? So those are up there. The rubric is there too, and of course everyone is welcome to whatever portion or idea that they can get from it, go for it. There's a couple links up here though that I just wanted to point out. This one in particular for English social studies, we just talked about the English component, but To Kill a Mockingbird is one of those books that stands beautifully on its own, but is also a wonderful doorway into ideas of social justice, race, gender, the history of Jim Crow laws in the United States, the history of identity and belonging. And so it's even looking at something as simple as code switching and those kinds of things, you can build so many avenues in. And this particular resource that's attached here, it's free online. So it's for all teachers, and it goes through chapter by chapter, section by section, how to marry both the history of the United States with teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, so that you lose nothing in terms of understanding the characters and the elements of story and the art of the story itself, but also understanding the historical context that was assumed, that was kind of an illusion throughout the entire story. That was never necessarily specifically, this is the history 2 decades ago, but it was because it was so intrinsic in the culture at that time that it would be woven in almost like an invisible thread. And so unwinding that thread and taking a look and kind of saying, okay, why is it so painful when we tug on it? What wounds is it opening? Are these wounds healed? Are they still festering? What does that look like today? So all of that is there in the To Kill a Mockingbird, is by facing history and itself and ourselves. Fabulous. The book itself, if you want to order the book, I do think that there's a cost to it, but the entire book is available online free. So I say just use it that. But for our math and social studies, for middle years in particular, this would work really, really well with your grade 7 content. It's Shop Till You Drop, which is basically giving a simulation of different access to wealth and different access to resources, and what does it mean to budget for your physical needs when you have less, when you have more, and how do those choices affect you? How does it affect your stress levels? And then how can you extrapolate that to a nation? What happens when a nation is struggling? What happens when a nation doesn't feel like it can meet its needs? So it's fabulous. Again, all there for you. And then the microloans obviously is a nice, easy connection to math, but it's building a business plan based on a need somewhere in the world, a real need. And so the students create some kind of solution that they can come up with, budget for it, create a whole business plan, go and evaluate each other's business plans to see which ones they think would work, which ones they think could use a little bit more time. A great starting point for that one is BBC World Hacks. Every week they come up with some random solution that can help people around the world that's cheap, easy, practical. And so those are just some great starting points where you think, you know what, we might not have time to do much with math, but I think we could at least do it in my classroom, and I can show the math teacher what we're doing. And then maybe next year we can build that bridge. Or you know what? For the To Kill a Mockingbird, I actually end up with an extra 2 weeks this year, miracle of miracles. And so I actually have time to teach To Kill a Mockingbird. They're not learning it in my particular school because of the course books that they've picked. And so I'm going to actually teach it in my classroom, even though I'm not an English teacher, because I'm going to be using it as a tool of understanding social justice. So it doesn't have to be cross-curricular to begin with. Sometimes just being really, really comfortable with the material on your end of it can allow those easy connections to be built, because you know the material. You can talk to the teachers and say, well, this is how I used it. This is how the students reacted to it. This is what I like to build into your course. How do you think that would work for you? And so starting with your own side is also a really nice way of doing it too.
Again, it connects back to what we were talking about earlier of kind of weaving things together, because maybe the English teacher, if you were at a school where To Kill a Mockingbird was being taught, and maybe the English teacher kind of already has their jam, they have their thing, and they're not really interested in doing a PBL, they can still provide, if you just work with that teacher to shift the timeline maybe. Like, yeah. Right, so you're teaching, the kids are reading the book in English class, and you know what the timeline is of where that teacher is taking them. Then in your social studies class, and it's great that you're able to kind of do both, you could just do the PBL in just the social studies class using the foundational text from the English class as a guide and as a stepping stone for that PBL, even if that teacher isn't expressly involved in the PBL. And I think your prediction is correct. If you did that 1 year where you just said, hey, can we line up our timing? And that was really all that you got that teacher to do. And you did that PBL that stemmed off of another teacher's content. The kids are going to be talking about that. It's going to come up in class discussions.
Absolutely.
And it's probably going to mean that at the end of that unit, that teacher, well, one of two things is going to happen. They could be furious, I guess. I don't really understand why, but right, like they could be like, oh, like this was hijacked. I don't know. Like I guess it's possible. But I would put my money on, they're going to go, hey, like, would you want to, right? And same thing, maybe the project-based learning is still happening in the social studies classroom. And maybe there's less of the, like the true project-based learning happening in the English classroom, but maybe you slowly shift and like keep taking those steps. So that's another great idea for how to start fostering cross-curricular collaboration. That would be a really awesome experience for those kids, even if the English teacher didn't change anything about what they were doing or how they were doing it.
I think sometimes with our symbiotic relationships, in the past, sometimes we've had a bad experience, right? And so they might be going into this whole kind of symbiosis thing. I know this is parasitical. This is me getting drained. This is me, you know, seeing some of like the great things I love doing in my class getting kind of like fluffed over here. And then I think like, oh, okay. And so I think that it has to go in with this idea of like mutual. We are going in this, you know, together. It might be in separate classrooms, and that's totally fine. But what we're going to be doing in my classroom is going to be enriching your discussions. You're going to notice in your students' RRJs that their understanding of the injustice and the deeper issues and some of those invisible, for lack of a better term, restraints that people are facing in that book that we might not even be aware of because we're at a different time. They're going to be able to talk about those. You might not have even had a chance to talk with them yet, but they might be aware of them because of where their PBL took them.
So that's a great reminder that PBL really does tap into that authentic passion as well as those different roles.
And so sometimes my cross-curricular isn't necessarily cross the hallway, but sometimes it can be like across the world. Sometimes it can be cross campus, right? Tapping into someone in another building or even like another school, right? So you might be tapping into going into the elementary school and teaching the students about Malala, right? You've decided to read the book, you're doing that cross-curricular approach, but you think, you know what, it would be really nice if the grade 3s, when they were learning about the Middle East and the regional study, that they were going to be learning about Malala and some really empowered young people, because sometimes the news can seem pretty sad. So there's lots of crossover that you can do. My big push always is some kind of positive, real, measurable impact, because that I think is one of the lasting legacies for students, is if they actually feel empowered to make a difference versus if they just feel informed. Informed is great. Informed is a perfect first step, but informed hopefully will lead to interested, and hopefully interested leads to impactful, because impactful, suddenly you feel like, okay, these are problems and I understand the problems and I'm also really passionate about them, so I need to do something about it. And I think our students naturally come into the classroom wanting to, and then sometimes they get kind of burnt out with the amount of news and the amount of negative, right? I mean, it happens. And sometimes I feel that when I'm looking at a newspaper and I'm thinking, yeah, and I'm not running like a hormonal roller coaster through my life right now. So these things are really present, I think. So Kids Boost Immunity, one vaccine for every correct quiz, and it's by UNICEF, so it's a United Nations community. So this is something that they do have access to areas where people really do need these vaccinations. Freerice.org, fabulous again. You can go on, you can pick any topic under the sun. It can be simple sums. It can be looking at English vocabulary building. It can be naming who painted that famous piece of art. It can literally be any subject. You can be identifying chemical compounds one day, and the next day flags of the world. But for every correct question, you're earning 10 grains of rice from the World Food Program to be donated somewhere in the world. And we create challenges sometimes. We have 5 minutes left in class. Okay, guys, who's going to have the biggest dinner tonight? And away we go. And we're challenging each other. How much can we donate? How much can we do? And it's one of those things that no matter how heavy the topic is that day, we could be talking about apartheid. We could be talking about Syria. We leave that day feeling at least we've done a tiny little part. And we also understand the snowball effect. We talk about it often in class. What's the catalyst? What's that change? What's that mindset that changes bystanders to upstanders? What does that look like? There's a lot of different pieces that you have to be aware of. You also have to be emotionally flexible enough with your own projects. And keep in mind, you might have been like investing hours in their prep. You've researched this, you know this, it is now part of you. And the students are not connecting with it. And you need to be able to either adapt it, change it, go with the flow. And if you're stuck in that, no, my friends, this is the PBL. And you might notice from my beautiful bullets on the handout that this is what we're doing and this is exact order. That might not work. And so I think part of the PBL also has to be a looseness on the side of a teacher, just to kind of have that, okay, so what I've learned is this, so why don't we adapt this? Why don't we shift this? This, I think, is going to work much better if we decide we're going to try it this way. So I think there's something to be said for that too.
Andrea Thiner, in another video, she did talk about that. She was like, you know, sometimes you're gonna feel like it really, really sucked and it was awful, or it's not going to go the way you thought or you wanted it to go. And so adaptation is always great. Going back to the kids is always great. Do also remember, the kids are probably having a much better experience than we think they are. Do look at those faces. If they're smiling and happy, if you hear laughter in class, if they're engaged and excited, that is the ultimate. But even when we feel like something didn't go perfectly or as good as we wanted it to, it was probably a really great experience for the kids. And the fact that you're trying something new and modeling the process of trying something new is invaluable and is going to be great for those kids, you know, no matter what. I am really excited that we got to hear about some of this cross-curricular collaboration, and I have a whole bunch of new ideas and particularly new approaches of how could I approach colleagues in a safe, supportive way that really takes my energy and idea and just kind of gives them the opportunity to collaborate. But you also did a great job of articulating ways that we can collaborate or draw from other content, or bring in a side coach and have a colleague teach one specific little mini lesson in their classroom. A lot of ideas for how do we just maybe slowly take some baby steps in kindling some potential cross-curricular collaboration. And it may take a year or two of sowing some of those seeds before someone is really ready. And I really like those additional reminders too of look up a grade level or two, look down a grade level or two, because we also know that a lot of content cycles. And so if I think of learning about biology, what we learned in 7th grade biology was repeated in 10th grade biology, was repeated in advanced biology, or AP bio, just at different levels. So what if there's a cross-curricular collaboration that could happen between those different grade levels that are working on some of the different thing? So maybe not cross-curricular, well, it would be cross-curricular still because it's different levels of curriculum. It's just moving up and down the band instead of across to different content areas. Or even reaching out internationally. There are great resources via even just things as easy as Flipgrid Pals, of all kinds of ways that you could do Skype connections or Flipgrid connections and have some asynchronous collaboration going on with a classroom around the world. So this has just been very enlightening and energizing to hear about all of these possible ways, because it can feel really daunting to tackle a PBL anyway, and then to add in that extra content. So these are some just really helpful reminders and tips of how you might approach some of that. So thank you for taking the time to share all of these ideas and all this wealth of resources as well.
My pleasure. My absolute pleasure. And it was nice. I don't know who was watching, but it was nice to make some connections in North Dakota. And I know, I mean, obviously Darcy is a wealth of resource, but if anyone wants more information about anything that I'm doing, please don't hesitate. Darcy has my contact information, and I'm always really excited to hear from people.
That's delightful. So yes, if you would like to reach out to Heidi, I will happily connect you to this international resource for some cross-curricular collaboration, either just ideas and inspiration or some actual possible work. So thanks. Please share any of your cross-curricular collaboration ideas, resources in the comments underneath the video, and we'll see you next time.